The Atlantic has been unusually quiet for most of this hurricane season, but that's starting to change, and the National Hurricane Center is now watching three separate areas at once for the first time in weeks. Right now, there are no tropical cyclones active anywhere in the Atlantic, but three distinct areas of interest are being tracked, and understanding what each one actually means, and more importantly, what it doesn't mean, is worth a few minutes of your time if you live anywhere near the Atlantic or Gulf coastline. It's been a genuinely unusual season up to this point, and that context matters for how seriously to take today's update. Seasonal forecasts issued back in the spring and refreshed at mid-season called for a below-average number of storms this year, and so far the Atlantic has largely delivered on that expectation, with named storm activity running well behind typical pace for this point in August. That's made the strong, persistent wind shear across the basin this year something of a running theme, effectively acting as a lid on tropical development even during weeks when waves have kept rolling off the African coast one after another. Let's start with the one drawing the most attention, a tropical wave that's expected to move off the west coast of Africa on Monday. The National Hurricane Center is giving this system a formation chance of 10% through the next 48 hours and 20% through the full 7-day window. Those numbers are worth sitting with for a second because they're genuinely modest. This isn't a system forecasters are treating as likely to develop imminently, it's one they're simply watching closely because of where and when it's emerging. An area of low pressure may form an association with the wave shortly after it moves off the African coast, and if it does, subsequent development would depend heavily on the environment it encounters as it tracks westward across the tropical Atlantic. By the way, if you'd like specific weather forecasts for your region or city, please leave them in the comments. I'll answer them individually as time allows. Also, if you like the video and subscribe to my channel, you'd be very grateful. Now, let's move on. Here's why this particular wave has forecasters paying closer attention than usual, even with modest formation odds attached to it. Wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height that can tear a developing tropical system apart before it has a chance to organize, has been unusually strong across most of the Atlantic basin for much of this season. It's acted almost like a barrier, and it's a big part of why this year has produced so few named storms relative to typical seasonal averages. But upper-level wind shear is expected to weaken somewhat over the Atlantic's main development region as we move through the coming week, and there's also an expected break in Saharan dust, another ingredient that's been suppressing development by drying out the atmosphere over the tropical Atlantic. If this wave's timing lines up with that window of weakening shear and reduced dust, its odds of organizing would improve, which is exactly the kind of setup that turns a modest formation chance into a system worth continuing to monitor closely over the following days. There's a second area of interest much closer to the United States, a weak area of low pressure located in the central subtropical Atlantic, a few hundred miles east-southeast of Bermuda. This one is producing disorganized showers and thunderstorms, and any development is expected to occur slowly, if at all, while it drifts westward through Sunday before accelerating north early next week. Formation chances here are also modest, 10% through 48 hours and 20% through 7 days. Given its position and expected northward track, this system is far more likely to affect shipping lanes and possibly Bermuda itself than the U.S. mainland, and its slow, weak development pattern makes it one of the lower priority systems on the board right now. The third area sits farther north and east, over the northeastern Atlantic, several hundred miles west of the coast of Portugal. This is a strong, non-tropical area of low pressure that could acquire some subtropical or tropical characteristics tonight or Sunday as it moves east-southeastward toward Portugal and northwestern Spain. Even if it does pick up some tropical characteristics briefly, the opportunity for that kind of development is expected to end by Sunday night as the system runs into an unfavorable environment. This one is essentially a European weather story rather than a US one, and it's worth mentioning mainly for completeness, since it's officially one of the three systems the National Hurricane Center has flagged today. Now here's the question everyone actually wants answered. Does any of this threaten the United States? Based on everything currently known, no, not in any way that warrants concern right now. None of these three systems currently pose a threat to the US, And it's worth remembering why meteorologists watch African tropical waves closely, even when their immediate formation odds look unremarkable. These waves are frequently the building blocks for the tropical storms and hurricanes that eventually track westward across the Atlantic later in the season. Watching one emerge with modest odds today doesn't mean it becomes tomorrow's headline storm, but it's the first step in a process that forecasters track from the moment a wave leaves the African coast all the way across the ocean. It's worth explaining a bit more about how forecasters actually track a system like the wave expected off Africa on Monday, since the process itself tells you why patience matters here. Once a wave crosses the coastline into the open Atlantic, forecasters begin monitoring satellite imagery for signs of organization, a tightening of the shower and thunderstorm activity around a defined center, evidence of a closed, low-level circulation, and any indication that the system is beginning to spin rather than simply drift as a disorganized cluster of storms. None of that happens instantly. It's a gradual process that can take anywhere from a few days to more than a week, and plenty of waves that look promising on day one fail to organize at all if they run into dry air, disruptive wind shear, or simply don't have enough time over warm water before reaching land or hostile conditions. That's also why the Hurricane Center's formation percentages update so frequently, sometimes multiple times a day once a system becomes an actual area of interest. Each new satellite pass and each new run of the global weather models refines the picture slightly, and what starts as a 10 or 20% chance can climb quickly if the system starts showing real signs of organization, or drop back towards zero if it runs into unfavorable conditions. The numbers you're hearing today reflect current confidence, not a fixed prediction of what's guaranteed to happen over the next week. It's also worth understanding why the position of the subtropical ridge, often referred to as the Bermuda High, matters so much for any system that does eventually organize in the deep tropics. This ridge of high pressure typically sits over the central Atlantic during hurricane season, and it acts like a wall that steers tropical systems along its southern and western edge. Where that ridge sets up and how far west it extends largely determines whether a storm curves harmlessly out to sea well before reaching land or gets steered on a more westward track toward the Caribbean or the U.S. coastline. Right now, it's simply too early to know how that ridge will be positioned by the time any of today's systems, if they develop at all, would reach the point where steering currents start to matter, which is exactly why the Hurricane Center isn't speculating on any specific U.S. impacts at this stage. Let's put this into the bigger seasonal context, because a quiet season doesn't mean a season with no storms worth watching. This stretch of the calendar, late August into September, is climatologically the most active period of the entire Atlantic hurricane season, when water temperatures across the tropical Atlantic have had the whole summer to build up heat, and the atmosphere is typically most conducive to organized tropical development. The fact that the Hurricane Center suddenly has 3 separate areas under watch after a stretch where the basin has often had nothing to track at all is consistent with the season simply arriving at its climatological peak rather than signaling anything unusual is happening. If you live along the Atlantic or Gulf coastline, this is a good moment to do the boring but important stuff. Check that you know your evacuation zone if you're in a coastal community. Make sure any hurricane supplies are current, and get in the habit of checking the Hurricane Center's outlook every day or two through the peak of the season, since these situations can evolve quickly once a wave actually organizes into a depression or storm. None of that is a response to any specific threat right now, since none exists. It's simply the standard, sensible posture for this point in the calendar, when the basin is most likely to produce systems with very little notice once conditions do come together. For now, treat all 3 of today's areas of interest as exactly what they are, things worth watching, not things worth worrying about. The wave expected to emerge off Africa Monday carries the most long-term relevance simply because of its potential path across the open Atlantic and the improving conditions it may encounter later next week. But even that system sits at modest formation odds today. One last piece of context worth keeping in mind as we head deeper into this stretch of the season. The atmospheric pattern currently bringing cooler, more active weather into the eastern United States isn't entirely disconnected from the tropical picture either. Troops digging into the eastern U.S., like the one currently pulling cooler air into the Ohio Valley and Northeast, can occasionally interact with tropical moisture or leftover frontal boundaries lingering near the Gulf, sometimes providing just enough spin for a homegrown area of low pressure to try organizing closer to home rather than tracking all the way across the Atlantic first. Nothing like that is currently being flagged by the Hurricane Center, but it's a reminder that tropical development this time of year isn't limited to systems crossing from Africa, and it's part of why the full Atlantic basin, not just the deep tropics, stays worth checking regularly through the peak of the season. Expect the picture to keep evolving over the coming days as the wave actually crosses the coast and forecasters get a clearer look at how it interacts with the wind shear and dust conditions currently in transition across the basin.